An in-depth look at the people and events that shape our community. This is Iowa in Focus.
This week, the reaction after a Russian fighter jet is brought down by another country also trying to fight ISIS. We sit down with one of the candidates calling for restraint in data collection even after terrorist attacks. Welcome to Iowa in Focus. The big news this week unfolded very early Tuesday morning between two countries loosely fighting for the same goal. Turkey shot down a Russian jet that was conducting bombing raids in Syria when the Turks said that that plane kept violating their sovereign airspace and ignored multiple warnings to leave. The Russians deny that the plane was over Turkey and that there were warnings to begin with, but either way, one of the two pilots was injured when he ejected and was later killed, either while falling to the ground or after he landed. The other safely returned to the Russian base. And Russia is now sending air defense missiles to its air base in Syria, and they've said that there will be repercussions for Turkey for what they did. Russian President Vladimir Putin wasn't mincing his words when he talked about what this meant to his country. He said it was a stab in the back from Turkey. That day, French President François Hollande was in D.C., speaking with President Obama about creating a coalition, including both the Russians and United States, actively working together to combat ISIS. The president said Turkey had every right to defend its airspace, but that what was more important was that both Turkey and the Russians opened a dialogue about what went wrong.
I do think that this points to an ongoing problem with the Russian operations, in the sense that they are operating very close to a Turkish border, and they are going after moderate opposition that are supported by not only Turkey, but a wide range of countries.
The president said if the Russians were directing their efforts exclusively towards ISIS targets, that there was more widespread agreement on fighting, this kind of mistake might not have happened. In the United States, we've been following local politicians weighing in on the Syrian refugee debate. The Obama administration has sent state officials across the country a reminder that states do not have the legal authority to refuse refugees. Many governors announced that they would not be taking Syrian refugees after terror attacks in Paris. The Office of Refugee Resettlement, though, sent out a letter saying that the states could not deny benefits or services to those refugees based on country of origin or religious affiliation. The letter says if they don't comply, they'd be breaking the law. There weren't many stops throughout the early primary and caucus states on the campaign trail this week because of the holiday. That still didn't keep Donald Trump and Dr. Ben Carson from getting into the headlines, though. It all started when Trump said that he saw Muslim communities in New Jersey cheering on 9/11 when the Twin Towers were attacked just on the other side of the river, separating New Jersey and New York. True to form, it was controversial, and some of the fact-checkers were having a hard time figuring out if it happened at all.
I watched in Jersey City, New Jersey, where thousands and thousands of people were cheering as that building was coming down.
At first, Dr. Ben Carson backed Trump up, saying that he saw the footage too. A few hours later, though, Carson's campaign said that the footage that he was referencing was actually in the Middle East and not New Jersey, and that he was mistaken while answering the question. Before the nation took off for Thanksgiving, Quinnipiac came out with its latest poll numbers, and for the Republicans, there was some movement. Donald Trump regains the lead from Dr. Ben Carson. Trump pulled in 25% of the vote. Carson dropped 10 points to just 18%. Texas Senator Ted Cruz jumped all the way to number 2 with 23% of likely caucus goers backing him, meaning it's a dead heat within the margin of error for the Republicans. The next day, the Democratic poll came out, and Hillary Clinton kept her lead in Iowa at 51%. Bernie Sanders is still in second place, and Martin O'Malley rounds out the three-person Democratic field. Between what could be an international crisis on the border between Turkey and Syria to some reshuffling in the Iowa poll numbers, we brought in University of Iowa professor Carrie Covington to break down what it all means for the 2016 race. We started by asking him how the race changes for candidates now that the sitting president is dealing with a big and potentially dangerous international issue.
Well, I think in terms of the election, what's important is that Obama is not running for re-election. So his returning to a more presidential rather than a political role won't have the benefit that it would if he were actually running for re-election. It does show his putting emphasis on the importance of this topic, and what it means for the candidates is they now have to talk more about national security, relations with other governments, foreign policy, terrorism, which isn't really the strong point of some of the candidates in both parties.
What kind of light does this all shine on something like Donald Trump's 9/11 comments, which would have been controversial in and of themselves, but now they come in a light where people are talking about these kind of issues a lot more seriously than they were before?
I think you have to ask that question in terms of two considerations. How does it affect his chance to win the Republican nomination? How does it affect his chance to win the presidency? I don't see much negative fallout for him when it comes to winning the Republican nomination. His supporters will write it off to hyperbole, if nothing else, because there is a germ of truth in that there were thousands of Muslims cheering the crashing of the towers, but it happened someplace else around the world, not in the United States. You saw Ben Carson make that course correction very quickly when he acknowledged, no, what I remember, it was actually in Palestine, not in Jersey City. It is Trump's nature not to admit any mistakes, and that's part of his persona, so he won't acknowledge that, but his supporters will cut him the slack he needs, and they'll like him for being aggressive. When it comes to the general election, this will be thrown in his face over and over and over again, and when you realize that 30 to 40% of the electorate now don't identify with either the Democratic or Republican Party, but rather vote on issues and ideology, factual claims that are clearly false will come back to haunt whoever makes those kinds of claims. You see Republicans trying to pin that sort of a reputation on Hillary Clinton right now with the Benghazi hearings. Is she telling the truth? Is she making a mistake? Is she acknowledging her mistakes?
Back to Ted Cruz, is there a reason to believe that his surge now is going to be more than just the latest candidate to come up, challenge Donald Trump, and then fall back again like we've seen people like Carly Fiorina do?
The thing to say about Cruz is he's got a strategy, and he's been building on that strategy for months. And much like, let's say, a NASCAR race, if you're in the back in the pack, you have to see a path to the front. Well, that includes the cars in front of you crashing or breaking down. And so I don't think it bothered Cruz that Carson might be out in front of him, because I don't think he saw Carson as a candidate with staying power. And so his job is not to beat down Carson. Carson will do something that will cause him to crash, or an issue will come along that he's not strong on. What he needs to do is be strong and ready to move when that opening appears ahead of him and his path to the front appears. And I think that's what he's doing. And it's not opportunistic. It's not like this fell in his lap. This is what he strategically has been planning on happening, and now he's moving to act on it.
The concern over terrorists and refugees hits close to home here in the corridor. The Mother Mosque of America in Cedar Rapids is the nation's oldest house of Islamic faith. For decades, Imam Taha Tawil says Iowa always welcomes Syrian refugees with open arms. That's why he says the refugee crisis shouldn't be about ISIS or terrorism at all.
Tucked away in one of Cedar Rapids' small neighborhoods,
it is from ground up, yes,
is this white and green building. It's the nation's oldest mosque. And Imam Taha Tawil says state officials asking to shut the door to refugees is hurting his faith.
This is the land of the free and the land of the brave. We didn't see anything so far pointing to tourists coming from immigrants.
Syrian immigrants built the Mother Mosque of America in 1934. And Imam Tawil says the history inside speaks for itself.
We have to stick with our principles. We have been welcoming community.
But with ISIS terror attacks in Paris, he says there's a deep divide seen in the fear-mongering generalizations about Islam.
When you say Muslims, we are not doing that. It's a few individuals.
He says he'd rather see heightened security efforts because that would at least give refugees a chance.
They are dying in the sea. They are dying in the desert. They are dying everywhere they go.
Imam Tawil says that he and other Islamic leaders are looking into ways to communicate with state officials about immigration policy. Coming up next on Iowa in Focus, we go one-on-one with the presidential candidate saying this is the worst time to collect more intelligence about citizens around the world, even if it's in the name of national security. Welcome back to Iowa in Focus. This week we're joined by Kentucky Senator Rand Paul. Senator Paul, thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here.
Unfortunately, not long ago, the Paris attacks in France, but now we are a few weeks removed from them now. What do you think that Americans are taking away from those attacks in terms of, the way that we try to prevent terrorist attacks and how they can be unpredictable, even though you have all these governments around the world using all their resources?
Yeah, I think the main lesson we take away is that there is a vulnerability, both in Europe and over here. And so one of the things I've spent the last week or so doing is introducing legislation to try to make it more safe or secure to prevent terrorists from actually coming over here. So I've looked at the refugee program, and my understanding is actually we do have some danger from the refugee program. In my town, Bowling Green, Kentucky, 2 of the Iraqi refugees came to our town and said, we're refugees, but then they tried to buy Stinger missiles, and we caught them. The interesting thing is when we caught them, we also determined that one of their fingerprints was already in a database because their fingerprints were on a bomb fragment in Iraq. So we should have known better, and yet we admitted them anyway.
While we're on policy, the bill that was just passed by the House, it's expected to get at least majority support in the Senate. How important is it for that bill to go through to, I guess, kind of raise the bar and raise the threshold for people coming from Syria?
It's a first step, and they include people from Iraq or Syria or who have traveled there. But see, we have other dangers as well. The people that committed the atrocity in Paris, I think, are going to turn out to be mostly, if not all, French citizens. Any one of them could have gotten on a plane and come to visit us anytime. We have almost no restrictions with travel for French citizens. They're called a visa waiver country. So my bill also would address that. It would say that if you're anyone in France, Germany, or England and you want to come visit us, you have to go through Global Entry. Global Entry is a program kind of like the frequent flyer program. You see the frequent flyer program in the airports now. Global Entry is the same thing internationally. You do a background check. And I think if we don't have controls like that, we are going to have people come from countries that are our allies, but they also have hotbeds of radicalism within their countries.
Is the premise that more information means a higher likelihood of stopping these attacks false, or?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and I think, there have been some people who have talked about this. There was a Nobel Prize winner by the name of Herbert Simon, and he said that it's important to know, and he was talking about consumer information, that sometimes you can get so much information that you get information overload and you don't make wiser decisions. You actually, your decision-making process is actually worse. Malcolm Gladwell has repeated this in things that he's written about when he said that knowledge does not equate to understanding. So sometimes you get too much knowledge, too much information, and you're actually overwhelmed with it, and you make worse decisions. So what I would say is we're making the haystack too large. What we should be doing is narrowing it. And as much as I'm an advocate of privacy, if you came to me and you say, well, the Russians tipped us off that the Boston bomber may have been radicalized, and then you said he's traveled to Chechnya and back, and we've interviewed people over there who say the people he was meeting with are terrorists. Absolutely, I'll give you, if I'm part of the government or I'm a judge, absolutely I'll give you permission to look at his records. And if he called 3 people from Pakistan or Yemen or 2 other people that you connect to terrorism, absolutely look at all their records. So I'm for that, but that's the Fourth Amendment. You've given me a name, you've given me suspicion, and you've called an independent judge. That's all I'm asking for. Not no collection of records, but that we're wise and prudent and that we use the Constitution so we don't become a police state where everybody's information is being gobbled up by the government.
Donald Trump's been in the headlines about this Muslim registry and the idea of signing people up for it. Is that dangerous? That sounds very dystopian.
Absolutely. And Marco Rubio said the same thing. Marco Rubio said he will shut down any site that might inspire people to become radical. Well, what I'm wondering is what kind of government official is going to be necessary to say inspire? Could that be the public library he's going to shut down? He said cafes, he said the internet. My goodness, that is very worrisome, and I think really should disqualify Rubio or Donald Trump from being commander-in-chief, because if you're willing to give up on the right to assemble and you want to register everybody from a certain religion and put them in a database, that really goes against everything our country stands for.
Coming up next on Iowa in Focus, the nations of the world have been dealing with refugees for centuries now. See how past generations have welcomed or turned away groups looking for a safe place to live. Welcome back. This is The Real Story, where we're going to take the time to give context to some of the events that go on during the 2016 race for the White House. Sometimes we'll have to go back a few days, weeks, or months, sometimes years, to find everything that's still relevant. As we find out today, especially, history does repeat itself. For nearly as long as people have identified with one group over another, there have been refugees. All it's taken is one group being in power and deciding that another group was no longer welcome, or even worse, would be killed if they stayed around. Situations like that have been tracked all the way back to 740 BC, when 10 of the roughly 12 tribes in the region were forced out of what is today ancient Israel. What we'll focus on today are the refugee situations that the modern world would have encountered and how they've reacted to them. About a decade into the 20th century was World War I. Roughly 200,000 Belgians were chased out of their homeland when the Germans invaded, and many of the Belgians went to Britain, where the government warmly offered them the hospitality of the British nation. There was some tension during the war, but when it was all over, many of the Belgians returned to their homeland. 27 years after the First World War, the Second World War broke out, and many more people were displaced while German forces made their way through the continent. For much of that war, the United States didn't take many special actions trying to help the Jewish refugees being chased by the Nazis. In June of 1939, 300,000 refugees were applying for just 27,000 visas set by quotas in the U.S. Those quotas didn't change until 1944, when FDR created the War Refugee Board to partner with a bunch of international organizations to save the Jewish people in Europe. By then, though, the Holocaust had already been going on for roughly a decade. What did happen was the creation of a number of groups and laws to help with refugees in the future, like the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. The end of the 20th century and the start of the 21st century gave us two very different refugee situations. In the early 90s, 2.7 million refugees were forced to flee from Bosnia. Tens of thousands landed in Western nations, mostly the United States and Germany. But in 2003, civil war in Darfur displaced 2.5 million people. Years later, nearly all of them are still on the run in their own country, with a few 100,000 living in refugee camps in Chad. When American forces went into Iraq in 2003, that started a stretch where nearly 5 million Iraqis would leave their home and about 2 million of them would flee the country. Many of them went to nearby states like Jordan, Syria, or Lebanon, but often were faced with more violence there. Now, some of them are running from the Syrian conflict too, and finding an international community with mixed reactions to their effort to leave the region. Roughly 4 million Syrians are on the run now. Almost 2 million of them are in neighboring Turkey. It's way more than that country can handle, but it's one of the closest nations around. Lebanon has about 1 million refugees in a country that only has 4 million people. Jordan and Iraq have both taken in plenty too. In Europe, Germany has received the most applications for refugees, and they're leading the way with Sweden trying to get quotas implemented that would spread the refugees around the continent. France, even after the terror attacks and fears about security breaches if more refugees come in, is committed to 30,000 more refugees. The United States has pledged to take in 10,000 Syrians, even with those strong concerns about screening procedures from politicians and citizens alike.
As Francois has said, our humanitarian duty to help desperate refugees and our duty to our security, those duties go hand in hand. On the Statue of Liberty, a gift from the people of France, there are words we know so well. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to be free.
Over the course of modern history, there's rarely been an extended period of time that didn't see a group of people needing a new and safe place to live. Just as common as the need appears to be the ability for other countries to be slow lending a helping hand. The point is that for all the debate it's creating around the world today, this problem is hardly a new one. Coming up after the break, the presidential candidate who's taking to Twitter to call out the entire Republican presidential field. Welcome back. We close the show each week taking a look at what happened on social media. And this week, North Liberty city leaders held a meeting to discuss the idea of a weapons ban on city property. It came after some concerns were raised by the library board in that city. We posted that story online, and TL said, does she honestly think that an illegal gun owner or someone who wants to kill someone will obey this resolution or law? Talking about the mayor. Taking away someone's constitutional right will not make things right or better. But Daniel chimed in with good luck on trying to enforce that unless you plan on hiring armed guards and paying them good money to frisk people. Now we take a look at their voice. That's what the candidates and their campaigns are posting up on social media. Last weekend, a Black Lives Matter protester was beat up at a Donald Trump rally. Trump responded by saying that the protester might have deserved what was coming because of the way he was behaving. And Democrat Martin O'Malley jumped on Twitter saying this: something is wrong with today's GOP when a hashtag Black Lives Matter protester is beaten up at a rally and frontrunner at real Donald Trump, that's Donald Trump, says maybe he deserved it. Later in the week, 1st District Congressman Rod Blum got in on the action, too. He was up in Decorah and posted this picture outside of the Bernie Sanders Decorah office saying stopped by to feel the burn in Decorah today, but no one was working. You can follow along on Twitter and Facebook all week long, see our interviews as we do them, chime in with what you think, and send us your favorite pictures as well. We upload the full shows and a lot of our features to our website, too. That's all in the Iowa in Focus section. Every week we end with the week ahead. That's what the candidates are doing, and so you have a chance to see what the campaigns have scheduled and where you can see the candidates you want to see. Republican John Kasich kicks the week off with events in eastern Iowa and central Iowa on Monday. Ted Cruz comes through the corridor in Coralville Monday morning. Saturday, 1st District Representative Rod Blum hosts the Rising Tide Summit in Cedar Rapids. The purpose of that summit is to promote smaller government, lower taxes, free markets, personal liberty, and the rule of law. Be sure to come back next week to get the clear facts right here on Iowa in Focus.